thank you for joining us. We are continuing on in this series called Majoring in the Minors, which is just going through the minor prophets. We started going through this on our Sunday mornings, and now you're taking us through a financial series right now on Sunday morning, but we decided to continue on just kind of going through some of the minor prophets here in this format. So just a few.
What distinguishes a minor prophet and a major prophet?
We will get into that. Really, at the end of the day, it's all about length. That's it. It's not about it's somehow less important. In fact, one of the things that I've become as we go through this and as I pay probably a lot more attention, really taking it apart, is you realize the messages weren't all that different. There weren't. They focused on a few little different things. Quite often, they would focus on hope, the remnant. They would definitely talk about repentance. But even when it talked about the things they were doing wrong, and the minor prophets definitely like different time and different eras and generations, and they were kind of every generation seemed to be doing a pretty similar thing.
Yeah, and I think that's safe to say that people are people, and at the end of the day, we don't really change all that much when it comes to things like corruption and evil. And
we seem to be stuck into that pattern, and Zephaniah definitely sees that and sees that we're kind of stuck in that pattern. And so, that's what we're talking about right now, Zephaniah. And again, just the talking about length. Zephaniah is 3 chapters.
Just 3 chapters. So in what context does Zephaniah happen? I know some of them were before Israel or Judah got taken into captive. Some were after. Where does Zephaniah fit into the picture?
Well, Zephaniah he's talking to the kingdom of Judah, so the southern kingdom. But this is after the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, has been conquered by Assyria.
Okay.
And actually just fairly shortly before, and when I say shortly, I don't mean like maybe 1 or 2 years, but fairly shortly before the southern kingdom would be conquered by Babylon. In fact, when he is talking about sort of like the day of the Lord and things like that, he really is talking about the eventual conquered from Babylon, which again is pretty close to that time.
Now, with all the kings of Judah, they kind of started off okay, and then they were sort of up and down, whether they followed God or didn't follow God. Where does Josiah fit into that?
Yeah, well, that's who Zephaniah is directly talking to at this point. And Josiah is considered a good king. He did bring reform, and that's actually something that stands out with Zephaniah in the fact that he did bring reform. So there's some indication that maybe he heard a little bit of Zephaniah's message, that played a part in him choosing to bring some reform, coming back into sort of a covenant understanding and observing it. And that's a pretty big deal because Josiah, again, he's kind of considered a good king in that sense of bringing those reforms. But his father and grandfather were considered some of the worst ones.
Yeah.
If we go into 2 Chronicles, they talk about that. So he's actually got quite a bit to clean up.
Yep.
And then, again, just sort of going the idea of nothing ever changes. Unfortunately, when Josiah has a tragic death, all those his sons who came after him kind of undid all the reforms that he had done. So that's kind of a neat thing because you don't really see this a whole lot in the prophets. It's kind of nice. We see a little bit of that with when we were covering some of the like Haggai and whatnot, where they encouraged those who came back from exile to get back to building the temple, and we know that they do.
Yeah.
And so, but a lot of the times we're hearing that the message kind of falls on unheard ears, and as much as ultimately unfortunately it does fall into some unheard ears. In the moment of Josiah, it seems that he was listening a little bit to Zephaniah. And I think this is another interesting kind of thing with Zephaniah that I think maybe could have played a part. I know some commentators sort of make some mention of it, is that Zephaniah is actually a descendant of Hezekiah.
And he was a king.
He was a king of Judah.
Okay.
And therefore, Josiah, who is the king of Judah, and that's the big difference between the southern kingdom as opposed to the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom, it wasn't a succession. It was people taking over and taking over. So lots of family. Coups, Exactly. This, through all of the existence of the southern kingdom, they all came from David.
Line of David.
They were all there. So Judah... sorry, not Judah. Judah is the kingdom. Josiah, who is the current king in this time, is the direct descendant of Hezekiah, as is Zephaniah.
Oh, interesting.
So they are actually related. They might, there's some distance because they'd be like great grandfather would be Hezekiah, but there is some connection there, and possibly that played a part. In fact, according to, I'm going to butcher this name, Augustine Ganachisian, he actually writes, Zephaniah's ancestry may have provided him with access to the royal court and a better reception of his message at that court.
Right, because he was related to the king.
Because there was some sort of relation of knowing, and therefore just added that currency to like, oh, I know you, I've known you for a long time, and maybe you have something that I need to hear. And so that's kind of an interesting kind of note to put in that.
Yeah, I think compared to some of the other prophets some were shepherds or from other professions, they weren't part of any royal line or royal family or even of noble birth. So a lot of times they were seen as outcasts.
Well, and a lot of times with some of the prophets too, is like we don't really know a whole lot about them. Like we kind of know maybe what town they came from. But like some of their message and is kind of really contained, to what they wrote or what they said. And here we do have, again, because in Zephaniah we do see that he's got connection to Hezekiah, which then just sort of makes like, okay, we've got some lineage here too. That is actually kind of neat.
Now, as I understand it, this book is a collection of poems, which many of the
and that's quite normal for a lot of the minor prophets is to write in a very poetic nature.
Okay, so let's sort of sum up what Zephaniah's message is.
Well, Zephaniah's message is the coming judgment, which we know plays out as Babylon conquering.
Yep.
And the judgment is this whole idea that Israel continually breaks the covenant, and even when they do good, like we do see it for this time in Josiah. We immediately after we're kind of back to the corruption that is in play.
And I think part of that may be the king is repentant, and he wants to bring the people back, but not everybody follows the king, or if they do follow the king, they do it to gain his favor and not because they've actually had a change of heart. Yeah,
and there seems to be, that's just it. It's more follow leader, which is an important aspect in all that. But yes, there's maybe not quite the same reform happening deep within the transformational of the heart happening in the whole kind of nation going on there. And that's kind of this unfortunate, again, cycle that they find themselves in. Anyway, so Tim Mackey actually kind of brings out how the poeticness of Zephaniah, especially just coming in chapter 1, verse 2, because he says this, and it sounds pretty harsh if we're just reading it, because sometimes in our translation we really lose a lot of the poeticness, because just the words and how they're structured. But he says this in verse 2, I will sweep away everything from the face of the earth, says the Lord. And he goes on to say, like, the people, the animals, the birds, the fish. And this is a poetic kind of response to essentially Genesis 1. And the whole idea, and this is what Tim Mackey talks about, basically how Genesis is about chaos and disorder to order. This is really pointing to the whole idea of order to disorder. So it's a reversal of Genesis 1. And the point of this is it's really about a dismantling of the oppressive systems, both political, societal, and religious, and that it's affecting everything. And so it's that whole thing, this whole order that's been set up, which is very corrupt. He's bringing it to a place of disorder.
So in order to bring it back into order, he's literally got to break it all down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Corruption has permeated the leadership, and like all the other prophets, they are speaking into it, and that corruption is greatly affecting the vulnerable. So those systems will be torn down, and we see that they are with the Babylonians when they come in. Now, in the whole thing is, and this is again a theme that we see throughout many of the prophets, and Zephaniah is no different, but he gets a bit more specific in this whole idea of compromising worship.
Okay.
Now, one of the things kind of present in the covenant is that they're supposed to have no other God but God.
Sure.
So they're supposed to have no idols. They're not supposed to participate or include any of those things in the ceremony. They are not supposed to participate in any of those ceremonies to other deities that are attached to other deities. Much less, what they're doing, bringing it alongside God and actually having it enter into places of worship like the temple.
So they're trying to get the best of both worlds, kind of thing.
Essentially, that's just it. It's just like they're like, "Hey, this is really good," and it becomes like I would almost say it's almost like. Keep all the options open worship.
Sure. Yeah.
It's like, just like, if I just start praying for this one, there's nothing happening. Oh, maybe I'll pray to this one. I'll pray to I will cover all the bases, and I'll try to do my best to please them all, and I'll get what I want.
The key thing there is to get what I want.
Just to get what I want.
Yeah.
And we'll just go to the one that does that. And so the prophets have talked about it. You go to every one of them. They'll hey, you're mixing some worship. It's really important, I think, to really take note here. It's not merely the fact that it's another deity, another god. Zephaniah brings up Baal, and many other prophets do, and that's a Canaanite god. He also mentions a god called Molech in verse 5, and so these two deities are kind of directly mentioned. And again, they're worshiping them alongside God. But the issue is that there's values that absolutely contradict.
Sure.
So we have to really see that it's not just, even though it is part of that, it's not just that it's another God, another deity that's not God or Yahweh. It's literally values that contradict. And quite often the offerings to these other gods were done through violence, deceit, and oppression of the vulnerable. That was actually part of the worship. The worship.
Which is totally in contrast to the way they were to worship God.
Well, an example to Molech was that they would do human sacrifice, and quite often it would be children. So they would offer children human sacrifice, to which children are considered, and we see this, quite often, especially when we go on to Jesus, that we're supposed to care for the children. Yeah. Well, they are considered vulnerable, and therefore to be worshiping Molech, it creates human sacrifice, and specifically children. Now, let's face it, we know at that time that if they're going to do human sacrifice, they're going to look at, well, who's expendable.
Yeah,
and so they're really contradicting values, because they are doing this worship at the expense of the vulnerable, of the poor.
And we know this is actually despicable to God, in that when he was instructing the Israelites when they first came into Canaan, and that he was to drive them out, one of the reasons he gave is that they were sacrificing their children to Molech.
Yeah.
And that was despicable in God's eyes.
Absolutely. And the fact that if you go back into read through covenantal laws, there was so much provision for the vulnerable.
Yes.
And here they're basically abusing. Basically is the wrong way to say it. They're absolutely abusing the vulnerable. Yep. And that is such a big and important thing to note, that there's these contrast. And so I really think this is we see the similarity to Jesus' challenge in Matthew 6:24. And you're kind of talking about this actually in the financial series that we're going through on Sundays.
You can't serve two masters.
You can't serve two masters. And specifically this way is money and God. Because at some point, they will contradict.
Yep.
I mean, the love of money, and I think we could see this still to this day, and it's something we've got to really fight against, can lead us to oppress others to acquire more.
Sure.
Therefore, instead of serving or loving others, we abuse and oppress them.
Yeah, and take advantage of them all the time.
Exactly.
We see that in lots of different places in culture. And we have different class systems. We don't just have the rich anymore. We have the uber rich.
Yeah.
And lots of times, and I'm not judging or making any specific cases against any one of them. I'm sure there are good people in those categories, but lots of times it's on the backs of other people, and they're paid so much more that it seems incomprehensible, the difference in what they may pay their employees, or they may have their things manufactured in another country where they have children or women who may not even get paid.
Slave labor.
It's basically slave labor to get the products to sell in our day. So I don't think that we can say that our culture is any better than it was in Jesus' time or even in the time of Zephaniah.
And I think that's such a message that can be so important for us today, and as much as maybe it's not a named god like Baal or Moloch, but that love that we have for money, which Jesus says is the root of all evil, so much brings us, and we're compromising things because of that. There's great compromise. The worship struggles completely diverge in its value systems. One of the things I think it's chapter 1, verse 9, so they're filling the master's houses, so the idea of the temple, with violence and deceit. So these things that are contradictory are actually brought in alongside and say, oh no, we can do this alongside. And he's like, no, these don't work. And so not only do they diverge, but they ultimately contradict. The people that these leaders, these wealthy, should be caring for are the very people that are abusing.
Yeah.
And so this is what's going on. And the other thing is going back to this money thing, it is a faulty foundation. The Israelites are putting their safety and well-being in their wealth. And we have this in chapter 1, verse 12 and 13. Basically, he kind of calls out the whole idea of when this happens, when, he doesn't say the Babylonians, we know it's the Babylonians, but when this day of the Lord is going to happen,
judgment,
you're going to lose it all. It's not going to protect you. It's not going to tell how you're going to get it out. All of those things that you value are going to go away. And this is the bad foundation. So it kind of leaves us with a challenge. And once again, I think the challenge is really no different than any of the other prophets. Yeah, I think it's like important as we read it and notice where the prophets, where Jesus, where all these people, where Paul, all of them just sort of repeat, and you're like, okay, you're saying it again. Oh, you're saying it again. Maybe it's being said so many times in so many different ways because it's really important.
Because it's really important, yeah.
It's those things that are said over and over again are really the things that we should stop and take note. And here we have, again, another minor prophet who's basically saying, hey, you got to return. He calls it to a repentance. And he says in chapter 2, verse 3, seek the Lord, all who are humble, and follow his commands. Seek to do what is right and live humbly.
Live humbly, yeah. And I think just basing off the series I'm talking about now, it comes down to priorities.
Yeah.
We have to have the right perspective, and that's the changing your mind part, or repentance. So we do have to change our minds.
Yep.
But two, we really have to make God the priority.
Yeah.
It's easy to make our priority family or money, or you can make the list on and on and on.
And I think that sometimes the hardest thing is that sometimes those things that we put in a too high a priority aren't necessarily all bad.
No, not bad.
Having a priority in a family is not bad.
No.
Having it in the wrong category could be really bad, or damaging, or not where it should be. And that's the thing. You're right. Priority is such a huge part of that.
And I think the next part that you've talked about here is also humility is key. I think wealth in particular makes us arrogant.
It can, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. And that's why I think humility plays a part. And when it says be humble and follow his commands, those commands are about setting the priority. And so if you have wealth, be grateful.
Yep.
Don't feel bad about it, but make sure the priority is there. Am I helping others in the midst of my wealth? What does that look like?
Yeah.
Not am I like, oh, this person, how can I squeeze more out of this?
How can I get more from me? Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that the key is with humility is, one, it's not about being unnecessarily harsh with ourselves. It's just about being honest.
Yeah, self-aware.
Be aware of our weakness, be aware of where our hurts are, where we've hurt, where we've missed the mark, but it's also being aware of our strengths. Like, it's not that. And it is ultimately seeking to do what is right. And I really think this really means more relational in nature.
Sure, I would agree, because that's, as Jesus summed up all of the prophets and the Torah, and it's your relationship with God and your relationship with other people.
Yeah, and it's not, and his key point, when the first is just as important as the second.
Yes, exactly.
And so it's all of that, and I think it's really important that we see this wherever we are, in a place of any kind of power, even if we feel like we don't have a lot of it. We might find ourselves in at least a little bit. Like, obviously we may not, be the movers and shakers in societal or political power, but if you have kids, there's a place of power. That right relationship needs to be also, how do I do that well with those who are vulnerable, those who who it is under me to take care of in some way or another. Absolutely. And I think just ways we can do this is stuff that we've been talking about over this kind of almost last year. We did a series called The Four Soils of Community, Thriving in Community. And I think if we can, the idea of be joy builders in the relationships we're in the community we're in, I think it's a way that we can walk right with people. And the other thing is making sure we're building hesed, or attachment love. Sure. And I think if we start just starting there in those moments, I think are right ways to walk in humility, but also to do what he commands, in that we build joy in others and we build attachment with others.
I think the two go hand in hand. Joy does build attachment. The minute you and I enjoy something together, it gives us something in common, and then that is a basis for us having a relationship where attachment love can be grown. So I know we've talked through a lot of different things here today, and hopefully you found something that was helpful to you. And again, just to end on that sort of relational note, to building joy in your life and attachment love in a relationship with other people, I think is a way to keep us humble and to, in community, help keep us on track so that we don't get too far off track lots of times, which obviously is human nature. It comes in cycles, and we see that all through the Old Testament and even the New Testament. So I think those are challenging words for us today. So I know if you can find someone to talk this over with, or maybe you belong to a church or a church group or a friend group even, where you can experience joy and attachment love. Those are the kind of ingredients that are needed to keep us humble and to have correction when we get off track. So thank you for watching today. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time for the next one in the series.